Hello, this is Paul and Phil Collins, and you are listening to another episode of the Collins Bros Unleashed. This week's show is going to be something of a continuation from last week when we explored the concept of mystical imperialism and its contribution to the power elite's current drive to transform America into an empire. Today we are going to explore one of its corollaries, namely internal discontent stemming from protracted imperial mobilization. The relevance of this issue was made painfully evident on November 5th, 2009, when U.S. Army Major and psychiatrist Nadal Malik Hassan opened fire in the Soldier Readiness Center at Fort Hood, a U.S. military post on the outskirts of Killeen, Texas. The shooting led to the deaths of 13 people and the wounding of 30 others. According to a November 5th, 2009 New York Times article authored by James Dow entitled "Suspect Was Mortified About Deployment," Hassan, quote, joined the Army right out of high school against his parents' wishes, unquote. The move, according to the shooter's cousin, Nader Hassan, was purely patriotic. Nader claims that when Nadal's parents protested his enlistment, Nadal responded, quote, "No, I was born and raised here. I'm going to do my duty to the country," unquote. Nadal's patriotism, however, seems to have been replaced by a conflict of conscience after the September 11th attacks of 2001. It was during this time that Nadal began to complain to relatives about other soldiers harassing and taunting him for being a Muslim. The terrifying prospect of deployment also intensified Nadal's internal conflict. Returning to the New York Times article, James Dow writes, quote, he, Nadal Malik Hassan, had also more recently expressed deep concerns about being sent to Iraq or Afghanistan, having counseled scores of returning soldiers with post-traumatic stress disorder, first at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington and more recently at Fort Hood. He knew all too well the terrifying realities of war, said a cousin, Nader Hassan, unquote. Quote, he was mortified by the idea of having to be deployed, Mr. Hassan said. He had people telling him on a daily basis the horrors they saw over there, unquote. Nadal may have even tried to express his concerns to senior Army physicians a year and a half ago. According to Dana Priest, in a November 10, 2009 Washington Post article entitled "Fort Hood Suspect Warned of Threats Within the Ranks," Hassan warned that Muslims in the armed services were facing a moral crisis during a presentation entitled "The Quranic Worldview as it Relates to Muslims in the U.S. Military." During that presentation, Nadal recommended that the Department of Defense, quote, should allow Muslim soldiers the option of being released as conscientious objectors to increase troop morale and decrease adverse events, unquote. It is obvious now that Nadal wished to be one of those conscientious objectors who could opt out of military service. But Nadal's presentation did not receive a positive response from attendees, and with no other recourse available to him, the American psychiatrist began a dark journey into radicalism. The descent into fanaticism may have begun even before the 9/11 attacks. In 2001, according to Philip Sherwell and Alex Spilius in a November 7, 2009 UK Telegraph article entitled "Fort Hood Shooting, Texas Army Killer Linked to September 11th Terrorist," Nadal attended the Dar al-Hijrah Mosque in Great Falls, Virginia. Nadal's attendance appears to coincide with the attendance of 9/11 hijackers Nawaf al-Azmi and Ani Anjour at the very same mosque. The mosque imam at that time was Anwar al-Awlaki, a preacher who authorities believe to be linked to Al-Qaeda. The radical ideas that Nadal picked up at Dar al-Hijrah may have remained dormant in his religious thinking until after 9/11, when taunting and harassment and the fear of imminent deployment made these ideas more attractive. Nadal Malik Hassan seems to have been a terrorist, but not in the simple way neoconservative media outlets claim. There has yet to be found any proof that Nadal was involved in a formal conspiracy. It seems more likely that his negative experiences in the armed services made the terrorist ideology more appealing to the 39-year-old Army psychiatrist. Nadal was rebelling against the prevailing sentiments within military culture. Those sentiments stem from a particularly brutal paradigm the military has adopted in order to carry out America's new imperial foreign policy. That paradigm was succinctly articulated in an article in the summer 1994 issue of Parameters, the official publication of the Army War College. The article was authored by Ralph Peters, a smug Army major who appears periodically on Fox News and whose ideas have appealed to the neoconservatives specifically and to establishment hawks generally. The article, entitled "The New Warrior Class," begins with the following remarks, quote, "The soldiers of the United States Army are brilliantly prepared to defeat other soldiers. Unfortunately, the enemies we are likely to face through the rest of this decade and beyond will not be soldiers with the disciplined modernity that term conveys to Euro-America, but warriors. Erratic primitives of shifting allegiance, habituated to violence with no stake in civil order. Unlike soldiers, warriors do not play by our rules, do not respect treaties, and do not obey orders they do not like. Warriors have always been around, but with the rise of professional soldieries, their importance was eclipsed. Now, thanks to a unique confluence of breaking empire, over-cultivated Western consciousness, and a worldwide cultural crisis, the warrior is back, as brutal as ever and distinctly better armed." Now, who are the erratic primitives that constitute the new warrior class? Peters states, quote, "Most warriors emerge from four pools which exist in some form in all significant cultures," unquote. And I place emphasis on all significant cultures. That would even include America and American culture. He proceeds to enumerate the four social pools and their respective warrior offspring. Quote, "First pool warriors come, as they always have, from the underclass, although their leaders often have fallen from the upper registers of society. The archetype of the new warrior class is a male who has no stake in peace, a loser with no education, no legal earning power, no abiding attractiveness to women, and no future. With gun in hand and the spittle of nationalist ideology dripping from his mouth, today's warrior murders those who once slighted him, seizes the women who avoided him, and plunders that which he would never otherwise have possessed," unquote. In other words, the first pool of erratic primitives is composed of unattractive and patriotic males who suffer the misfortune of occupying a lower layer of the socioeconomic stratum. Peters proceeds to examine the second pool, warriors. Quote, "As society's preparatory structures such as schools, formal worship systems, communities and families are disrupted, young males who might otherwise have led productive lives are drawn into the warrior milieu. These form a second pool. For these boys and young men deprived of education and orientation, the company of warriors provides a powerful behavioral framework," unquote. So, as the elite co-ops in traditional institutions, Peters foresees the emergence of youthful dissenters. These younger erratic primitives are potential recruits for the warriors. They too must be expunged. Reiterating his globalist Weltanschauung, Peters proceeds to identify patriots as the next class of warrior. Quote, "The third pool of warriordom consists of the patriots. These may be men who fight out of strong belief, either in ethnic, religious, or national superiority or endangerment, or those who have suffered a personal loss in the course of a conflict that motivates them to take up arms," unquote. one has to wonder what kind of personal losses Peters might be referring to. Losses like, say, Waco, or, say, bailouts to major corporations on the taxpayer's dime. This particular variety of warrior would probably oppose the amalgamation of his or her respective nation-state into the elite's worldwide dictatorship. Therefore, it must be eradicated as well. Finally, Peters reveals the fourth pool of warriors. Quote, dispossessed, cashiered, or otherwise failed military men form the fourth and most dangerous pool of warriors. Officers, NCOs, or just charismatic privates who could not function in a traditional military environment. These men bring other warriors the rudiments of the military art, just enough to inspire faith and encourage folly in many cases, although the fittest of these men become the warrior chieftains or warlords with whom we must finally cope, unquote. These soldiers of the so-called obsolete military paradigm have no place in the elite's military establishment. The duty of the new soldier no longer involves the protection of nation, family, or the traditional way of life. These are outdated constructs embraced only by warriors awaiting their coming extermination. Thus, the soldier of the past also constitutes a threat. Now, according to Peters, the erratic primitives that comprise this emergent warrior class represent a global epidemic. Quote, worldwide, the new warrior class already numbers in the millions. If the current trend toward national dissolution continues, by the end of the century there may be more of these warriors than soldiers in armies worthy of the name. While exact figures will never be available, and statistics junkies can quibble endlessly as to how many warriors are really out there, the forest looks dark and ominous enough without counting each last tree. And perhaps the worst news comes right out of Macbeth. The trees are moving, unquote. It's interesting that Mr. Peters does not want to quibble about statistics and basically come to some kind of figure as far as the number of warriors in the world out there. This allows him to keep things nice and vague and keep the enemies coming for a long, long time. In his mind, the warriors will never stop coming, and the warriors will always be out there, and it keeps the cycle of warfare going. Peters predicts a period of protracted conflict with these warriors. Quote, the U.S. Army will fight warriors far more often than it fights soldiers in the future. This does not mean the Army should not train to fight other organized militaries. They remain the most lethal, although not the most frequent threat. But it would be foolish not to recognize and study the nasty little men who will haunt the brutal little wars we will be called upon to fight within the career spans of virtually every officer reading this text, unquote. To counter this threat, Peters recommends the following prescriptive measures. Quote, although there are nearly infinite variations, this type of threat generally requires a two-track approach. An active campaign to win over the populace, coupled with irresistible violence directed against the warlords and the warriors. You cannot bargain or compromise with warriors. You cannot teach them a lesson unless you believe that Saddam Hussein or General Adid have learned anything worthwhile from our fecklessness in the clinch. You either win or you lose. This kind of warfare is a zero-sum game. And it takes guts to play, unquote. So in other words, you have to carry out a propaganda campaign and brutal aggression as the solutions to the warrior problems. Now, the other question that we have to ask at this point is, does the Abu Ghraib situation that occurred a few years back, does this apply to does the Peters model apply in this instance? In other words, was Ralph Peters ideas basically carried out in some form or another at Abu Ghraib. Consider the abuses that were delineated by a United States Army report. The report lists the following abuses at Abu Ghraib. Quote, A, punching, slapping, and kicking detainees, jumping on their naked feet. B, videotaping and photographing naked male and female detainees. C, forcibly arranging detainees in various sexually explicit positions for photographing. D, forcing detainees to remove their clothing and keeping them naked for several days at a time. E, forcing naked male detainees to wear women's underwear. F, forcing groups of male detainees to masturbate themselves while being photographed and videotaped. G, arranging naked male detainees in a pile and then jumping on them. H, positioning a naked detainee on an MRE box with a sandbag on his head and attaching wires to his fingers, toes, and penis to simulate electric torture. I, writing "I am a rapist" on the leg of a detainee alleged to have forcibly raped a 15-year-old fellow detainee and then photographing him naked. J, placing a dog chain or strap around a naked detainee's neck and having a female soldier pose for a picture. K, a male MP guard having sex with a female detainee. L, using military working dogs without muzzles to intimidate and frighten detainees, and in at least one case, biting and severely injuring a detainee. M, taking photographs of dead Iraqi detainees, unquote. Judging by the United States Army report over Abu Ghraib, the abuses, Peter's ideas were almost certainly put into practice at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. Now, in order to find people who possess the attributes of Ralph Peters' ideal soldier to fight the emerging warrior class, the military appears to be turning to radicalized sections of the population as recruitment pools. One of those recruitment pools is the white supremacist movement. In a June 15th, 2009 article for Salon magazine entitled "Neo-Nazis Are in the Army Now," Matt Kennard contends that the U.S. military is ignoring its own regulations so that it can maintain recruitment numbers by allowing white supremacists to join. Kennard writes, quote, "Since the launch of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the U.S. military has struggled to recruit and re-enlist troops. As the conflicts dragged on, the military has loosened regulations, issuing moral waivers in many cases, allowing even those with criminal records to join up. Veterans suffering post-traumatic stress disorder have been ordered back to the Middle East for second and third tours of duty. The lax regulations have also opened the military's doors to neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and gang members with drastic consequences. Some neo-Nazis have been charged with crimes inside the military, and others have been linked to recruitment efforts for the white right," unquote. Parenthetically aside, notice that the article also said that gang members had become part of the recruitment pool. We have to tip our hats right now to Burt Meals, who has pointed out to us in conversations off the air that he was finding considerable amounts of evidence that gangs have actually become recruitment centers for the U.S. military as well. So give yourself some props, Bert, because you were right on the money, it would seem. Imperial overstretch has left the military with a serious personnel problem. The old saying, "beggars can't be choosers," now seems to apply when it comes to the recruitment process. Former military investigator with the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Command, Carter F. Smith, described the situation to Kennard. Returning to the article now, quote, When you need some more soldiers, you lower the standards, whether you say so or not, he, Carter, says. The increase in gangs and extremists is an indicator of this. Military investigators may be concerned about white supremacists, Carter says, but they have a war to fight and they don't have incentive to slow down. Unquote. No less a guiding light in the white supremacist movement than the infamous Tom Metzger concurs with Smith's analysis. Kennard elaborates, quote, Tom Metzger is the former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan and current leader of the White Aryan Resistance. He tells me the military has never been more tolerant of racial extremists. Now they are letting everybody in, he says, unquote. Telltale signs and identifiers of white supremacism are now being completely ignored. Kennard discovered this during an interview with an Army Public Affairs officer. He writes, quote, when it comes to screening out racists at recruitment centers, military regulations appear to have collapsed. We don't exclude people from the Army based on their thoughts, says S. Douglas Smith, an Army Public Affairs officer. We exclude based on behavior. He says an offensive or extremist tattoo might be a reason for them not to be in the military, or it might not. We try to educate recruiters on extremist tattoos, he says, but the tattoos is a relatively subjective decision, and it shouldn't in itself bar enlistment. What about something as obvious as a swastika? A swastika would trigger questions, Smith says. But again, if the gentleman said, I like the way the swastika looked and had clean criminal record, it's possible we would allow that person in. There are First Amendment rights, he adds, unquote. Kennard also conducted an experiment to see if racists were being filtered out by recruiters. The results of that experiment were nothing less than frightening. Kennard shares his findings. Quote, in the spring I telephoned at random 5 Army recruitment centers across the country. I said I was interested in joining up and mentioned that I had a pair of SS bolts tattooed on my arm. A 2000 military brochure stated that SS bolts were a tattoo image that should raise suspicions. But none of the recruiters reacted negatively, and when pressed directly about the tattoo, no one said it would be an outright problem. A recruiter in Houston was typical. He said he'd never heard of SS bolts and just encouraged me to come on in, unquote. To dramatically illustrate his point, Kennard shares the case of Iraq War veteran Forrest Fogarty. At 14 years old, Fogarty decided to become a Nazi after being bullied by black and Latino children and after being exposed to the music of hate rock bands. Fogarty determined to go into the military when he was around 22 years of age. When the white supremacist stepped into a Tampa recruitment office, his suspicious tattoo should have alerted recruiters to Fogarty's racist background. The recruiters, however, accepted Fogarty's flimsy explanations for the tattoos, and Fogarty soon found himself at Fort Stewart in Georgia, quote, where he became a member of the 3rd Infantry Division, unquote. When Fogarty's ex-girlfriend provided Fort Stewart with pictures of the white racist attending white supremacist rallies, performing with his Nazi rock group Attack, Fogarty found himself before a committee having to explain his activities. Fogarty informed the committee that his ex-girlfriend, quote, was a spiteful bitch, unquote, and the accusations were dismissed. According to Fogarty, the military was fully aware of his affiliation with hate groups. Returning now to the article, quote, because of his tattoos and racist comments, most of his buddies and commanding officers were aware of his Nazism. They all knew it in my unit. They all knew in my unit, he says. They would always get around and say, "Hey, you're that skinhead," but no one sounded an alarm to higher ups. I would volunteer for all the hardest missions, and they were like, "Let Fogarty go." They didn't want to get rid of me, unquote. Fogarty ended his military career in 2005 with an honorable discharge, but not before being offered an opportunity to re-enlist. His story painfully demonstrates the case with the ease with which white supremacists can move through the system. Purging the likes of Fogarty from the military may not be easy. As Peter's ideas gain ground among the Army's ranks, a negative, even racist view of the enemy is being encouraged. Soldiers for the opposing side, in keeping with Peter's prescription, are being presented as warriors and are being therefore dehumanized. As a consequence of this, racism is becoming systemic and institutionalized. Kennard confirms this by stating in his article, quote, "Rooting out extremists is difficult because racism pervades the military," according to soldiers. They say troops throughout the Middle East use derogatory terms like Haji or sand nigger to define Arab insurgents, and often the Arab population itself. Racism was rampant, recalls vet Michael Prisner, who served in Iraq in 2003 and 2004 as part of the 173rd Airborne Brigade. All of command everywhere, it was completely ingrained in the consciousness of every soldier. I've heard top generals refer to the Iraqi people as Hajis. The anti-Arab racism came from the brass. It came from the top, and everything was justified because they weren't considered people. Parenthetically speaking, recall Peter's prescription that the new enemy be viewed as erratic primitives. Therefore, you have to dehumanize your enemy and not consider them people. Returning to the article, quote, another veteran, Michael Totten, who served in Iraq with the 101st Airborne in 2003 and 2004, says it wouldn't stand out if you said sand niggers, even if you aren't a neo-Nazi. Totten says his perspective has changed in the intervening years, but at the time I used the words sand nigger. I didn't consider Haji to be derogatory. Jeffrey Millard, an organizer for Iraq Veterans Against the War, served in Iraq for 13 months beginning in 2004 as part of the 42nd Infantry Division. He recalls General George Casey, who served as the commander in Iraq from 2004 to 2007, addressing a briefing he attended in the summer of 2005 at Forward Operating Base outside Tikrit. As he walked past, he was talking about some incident that had just happened, and he was talking about how these stupid fucking Hajis couldn't figure shit out. And I'm just like, are you kidding me? This is General Casey, the highest-ranking guy in Iraq, referring to the Iraqi people as fucking Hajis. A spokesperson for Casey, now the Army Chief of Staff, said the general did not make this statement. The military is attractive to white supremacists, Millard said, because the war itself is racist. Unquote. But white supremacists and Ralph Peters are not the only ones having a negative influence on the U.S. military. There has also been an overtly satanic element actually subverting the United States armed services. But before we proceed any further, Paul and I would first like to thank our sponsor, Suke Koji, Martial Arts and Ninja Gear. Suke Koji offers instructional tapes, books, martial arts attire, swords, grappling hooks, and other pieces of equipment, all for your martial arts need. And we highly recommend his establishment, and we are very, very grateful to him for his gracious sponsorship. We'd also like to take this moment to thank Burt Mills for providing us with this valuable platform, and to thank Randy Moggins, the host of the outstanding show, The Threshing Floor, for also lending his technical skills in the production of this show. We recommend his show, The Threshing Floor, to all the listeners out there. For those listeners who would like to check out a copy of our book, The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship, you can do so by going to Amazon.com. You want the 2006 Book Surge edition. It's expanded and revised with twice as much information as opposed to the first edition. And the entire title is The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship, an examination of epistemic autocracy from the 19th to the 21st century. And much of the information in there is still timely, and we are witnessing, in fact, many of the prophecies and predictions that we made in that book actually coming to pass here and now. We also visit the Ralph Peters article that was quoted from extensively in that book. Now, carrying on the conversation regarding the systemic corruption of the military, we look to the bizarre case of Army Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino. In 1975, U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino formed the Temple of Set, a satanic sect, whose governing body, a Council of Nine, was composed of Aquino's chief lieutenants. Aquino had spent the previous 10 years as a member of Anton LaVey's Church of Satan in San Francisco. However, a rift formed between Aquino and LaVey when the lieutenant colonel learned that his mentor in Satanism was selling religious offices in the Church of Satan to anyone willing to pay for them. Aquino believed that LaVey's unabashed commercialism threatened to corrupt the pure corpus of Satanism. For Aquino, Satanism was reserved for an elite constituted by genetically and intellectually superior stock. This rift notwithstanding, Aquino's Temple of Set further affirmed LaVey's bold proclamation that Satanism had become the, quote, new establishment, unquote. Through the Temple of Set, Aquino introduced the military establishment to Satanism and further acculturated the halls of officialdom to radical, if not downright criminal, ideas. Thus, Satanism was indeed becoming the new establishment by co-opting a portion of the old establishment. Yet, given the transparently nefarious character of Aquino's beliefs, one must question the extent to which the U.S. Army could qualify as a so-called victim of the satanic epidemic. In the January 12, 1988 issue of Inquirer magazine, Aquino told reporter Chris Fuller, quote, "My religion has been no secret in the Army," unquote. Now, while the Inquirer certainly is one of the more reputable publications in the world of print journalism, other reliable sources have confirmed not only the Army's foreknowledge of Aquino's religious views, but also the former lieutenant colonel's involvement with a nationwide pedophile ring. Paramount among these sources is Noreen Gosch, whose son, Johnny, was abducted off of the streets of West Des Moines, Iowa, on September 5, 1982. During the case of Paul A. Bonazzi versus Lawrence E. King in February 5, 1999, Gosch presented sworn testimony to the U.S. District Court in Lincoln, Nebraska. 3 weeks after the presentation of Gosch's testimony, Judge Warren K. Urbam ordered King to pay $1 million in damages to Bonazzi. Now, for John DeCamp, Bonazzi's lawyer, this order suggested that, quote, the evidence presented was credible, unquote. The possible credibility of that evidence holds broader ramifications when viewed in conjunction with the case of Aquino. Distilling the findings of her investigation into the Satanic Underground, Gosch revealed, quote, We have talked to, so far, 35 victims of this said organization that took my son and is responsible for what happened to Paul, and they can verify everything that has happened. What this story involves is an elaborate function, I will say, that was an offshoot of a government program. The MK Ultra program was developed in the 1950s by the CIA. It was used to help spy on other countries during the Cold War because they felt that other countries were spying on us. It was very successful. They could do it very well. Well, then there was a man by the name of Michael Aquino. He was in the military. He had top Pentagon clearances. He was a pedophile. He was a Satanist. He's founded the Temple of Set. And he was a close friend of Anton LaVey. The two of them were very active in ritualistic sexual abuse, and they deferred funding from this government program to use in this experimentation on children. When they deliberately split off the personalities of these children into multiples so that when they are questioned or put under oath or questioned under lie detector, that unless the operator knows how to question a multiple personality disorder, they turn up with no evidence. They use these kids to sexually compromise politicians or anyone else they wish to have control of. This sounds so far out and so bizarre, I had trouble accepting it in the beginning myself until I was presented with the data. We have the proof in black and white. I know that Michael Aquino has been in Iowa. I know that Michael Aquino has been to Offutt Air Force Base. I know that he has had contact with many of these children, unquote. Gosh's claims were further substantiated by Benazzi, who was a victim of the very same satanic underground that claimed Johnny Gosh. In his February 5th testimony, Benazzi identified the architect of the Gosh abduction as, quote, the Colonel, unquote. Yet the misdeeds of Aquino are not restricted to the Benazzi and Gosh cases. Aquino's satanic crime resume encompasses many more years and many more lives. The extensiveness of this resume calls into question the Army's ignorance of Aquino's deviant proclivities. In August of 1987, the 3-year-old daughter of Larry Thompson Adams, an assistant chaplain at the Presidio, accused Aquino and his wife Lilith of sexually abusing her. In therapy sessions, the girl spoke about being molested by Gary Hambright, a Baptist minister who taught the girl's class at the Presidio daycare. The girl also claimed that a man named Mikey and a woman named Shamby participated in the abuse with Hambright. Yet these were mere aliases for Aquino and Lilith, as is revealed by Lyndon Goldston in a July 24, 1988 San Jose Mercury News article entitled Army of the Night. In that article, Goldston states, quote, on August 12, 1987, the Adams-Thompsons were shopping at the PX at the Presidio. Suddenly, the girl ran to Larry Adams-Thompson and clutched his leg. He looked up and saw a man whom he knew as Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino. Yes, that's Mikey, the 3-year-old told Adams-Thompson. After being taken outside, the girl added, he's a bad man, and I'm afraid. As they were leaving the parking lot, the Adams-Thompsons saw Aquino's wife, Lilith. Larry asked the child if she knew the woman. Yes, that's Shamby, the girl said, unquote. The family immediately contacted the FBI. The Adams-Thompsons' daughter identified Hambright as one of her abusers in a photo lineup and told authorities about how he transported her from the daycare center to the home of Mikey and Shamby. Once there, the girl was sexually abused and photographed. To verify these claims, investigators took the girl to Leavenworth Street in San Francisco, where she was asked to identify any houses that she could have recognized from previous trips. The girl identified 2430 Leavenworth, the Aquino residence, as the place she met Mikey and Shamby. On August 14th, authorities served a search warrant on the Aquino home. Both the FBI and San Francisco police cooperated in the search. The investigation was considered a city case because the abuse allegedly occurred on city property. Cassette tapes, videotapes, 2 photo albums, 4 plastic cases, negatives, 29 photos of masks and costumes, a paper plate, 2 plastic gloves from the kitchen garbage, and notebooks containing addresses and names were seized from the residence. No formal charges were ever brought against Aquino. The preponderance of evidence notwithstanding, Aquino and Lilith branded the investigation as a witch hunt. This mantra was reiterated ad nauseum by Aquino in the aftermath of the abortive investigation. 2 months after the search of his home, Aquino characterized the investigation as the product of a Christian vendetta. Aquino voiced this contention in a Temple of Set newsletter, citing Adams Thompson's vocation as a Christian clergyman as one of his chief motivations for initiating the so-called witch hunt. Aquino expressed similar sentiments in a 4-page letter he sent to a Southern California children's advocate group in April. Aquino wrote, quote, "We do not intend to see a replay of what happened in Nazi Germany when the reluctance of the Jews to challenge those who systematically and falsely accused Judaism of heinous crimes, including the sexual abuse and ritual murder of Christian children, led to violence against them," unquote. Now, Aquino's denunciation of Nazism is rendered somewhat disingenuous when considered with his religious sect's bizarre preoccupation with the cultural artifacts of Nazi Germany. Many Satians donned Nazi war attire, and according to Goldston, Aquino himself performed a satanic ritual in a Westphalian castle that acted as an occult sanctuary for the elite of Heinrich Himmler's SS. Aquino's ritual was performed during a NATO tour of Europe in 1982. None of these antics ever prompted the Army to suspend Aquino's security clearance, however. Evidently, the Army considered Aquino an asset and retained his services for pragmatic purposes. In turn, the Army's retention of Aquino facilitated the co-option of a portion of the old establishment by the new establishment, that is to say, Satanism, in the words of LaVey. Arguably, the Army's pragmatism predisposed it to such co-option. Those who believe in nothing fall for anything, and those who believe only in their own self-interest fall for anything that promises gratification. The philosophy of pragmatism assesses the value of ideas and beliefs in terms of the dividends yielded through their practical application. Isms don't concern the pragmatist. All that matters to the pragmatist is how the application of isms profits them. The core normative claim of pragmatism is that beliefs and ideas ought to be formulated with regard to utility alone. In short, beliefs and ideas are merely a means to an end. For the pragmatist, it doesn't matter how morally questionable those beliefs and ideas might be. Such thinking underpins the dictum of Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the infamous Bavarian Illuminati, who declared, quote, "The ends justify the means," unquote. It also underpins the dictum of occultist Aleister Crowley, whose infamy echoes on through history, and who declared, quote, "Do what thou wilt," unquote. The enshrinement of such aphorisms gives way to the obliteration of moral absolutes and the apotheosis of self-interest. In a sense, pragmatism really qualifies as Satanism under merely another appellation, whether or not its adherents are cognizant of the satanic undercurrent of their own philosophy is inconsequential. Such is the case with the U.S. Army, whose pragmatism provided the conduit for a more overt form of Satanism. To put it simply, Satanism enrolled in the Army, and it found that the devil was already there. And just what pragmatic purposes was Aquino serving? As was previously revealed in the sworn testimony of Gosch, Aquino deferred funding from MK to finance his experimentation on children. Aquino, like the various other social engineers of the MK program, viewed the human psyche as a tabula rasa, awaiting the enlightened brushstrokes of elite conditioners. This view was premised on behaviorism, which holds that man is little more than an amalgam of behavioral repertoires, an animated lump of flesh whose every thought and feeling is a biochemical response to external stimuli. One could argue that such a view originated with Amanitist Gnosticism. which biologicized the pneuma, or spirit, of man and sought to mitigate its alienation through the conscious resculpting of externalities and ultimately reality itself. If the listeners will recall, in episode 1, the discussion of Gnosticism, sociopolitical utopianism, and Darwinism, the Gnostic optic was consistently focused on the surroundings of man, the world in which he found himself alienated, and the externalities that constituted it. Gnosticism eschewed the concept of original sin, and that rejection of original sin translated over into a Manitist Gnosticism, or secular Gnosticism, neo-Gnosticism. And as a result, we have the rise of soteriological social movements, sociopolitical utopian radicals, who believed that there was no systemic corruption within man, which Christians know as sin, but it was the corruption of his surroundings. For instance, the redemptive view of history as espoused by Marxism, which was one variety of Humanitist Gnosticism, believed that man could be redeemed from thousands of years of class exploitation, and that this would result in the rise of the proletarian dictatorship and stateless socialism, and we would have the instantiation of the Marxist variety of an Edenic motif. Again, the astute listener will notice the complete and total rejection of original sin. All of the corruption, according to the Humanitist Gnostic of the Marxist stripe, originates with man's surroundings, with externalities, with the world in which he finds himself alienated. And of course, alienation was a theme on which Marx wrote extensively. And in another brief aside, it's interesting to note that Marx posed his philosophy of governance as a means by which that alienation could be mitigated. However, when you have the enshrinement of an omnipotent state that confiscates the wealth of all of its citizenry and basically removes all incentive to work, and also results in the stymieing of economic progress, the stultification of the economy because of the lack of incentive, one could argue that alienation remains a permanent fixture of that utopian scheme as well. Another example of the Gnostic optic on history and the redemptive missions set out embarked upon by Humanitist Gnostics is Hitlerian fascism, in particular Hitler's Aryanism. For Hitler, it was not original sin that corrupted man, but the blending of races that caused a fall from racial purity, the first root race, into several competing races. And thus, man had to be redeemed from this genetic and racial corruption through the extermination of the Jews. And this racism finds its origins with the traditional Gnostic eschewal of original sin, and also promised the neo-Gnostic return to a singularity. In fact, all neo-Gnostic philosophy promises a kind of monism. And in fact, if one examines globalism closely, one will just find a form of political monism. The dictum "all is one" finds political expression through globalism, through the amalgamation of all nation-states into a political singularity, into a one-world superstate. At any rate, this is a digression, but it's nevertheless pertinent, because such views also led to the emergence of behaviorism. Now, such thinking was consistent with Aquino's occult philosophy, as was evidenced by his remarks during an October 1988 interview with Oprah Winfrey. Aquino stated that, quote, "Satanism is a recognition that humanity, unique among life forms, is something that can perceive itself as an actor against the rest of the material universe, that we can reach out and we can change it, unquote. And Michael Aquino chastised Christianity for its proffering of a transcendent creator and its overall transcendent elements, because those transcendent elements, he claimed, divorced man entirely from the material cosmos, which could be, through the efforts of man, transformed. This concludes side one of this discussion. Hopefully all the listeners can tune in to catch side two as we continue the discussion of Aquino and bring this entire discussion full circle back to the systemic corruption of the military and its seeking for recruits in radical recruitment pools. We would like to also advise you at this time to look up some of the articles relevant to this topic on the web. Articles that we used in this discussion include a Salon article entitled "Neo-Nazis Are in the Army Now" by Matt Kennard, Goldston's article, Army of the Night, which is also still available online from the San Jose Mercury. And we also used a 1994 Parameters article entitled "The New Warrior Class" by Ralph Peters. And much of this information, again, can be found in our book, The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship. The 2006 edition is the one that you want to get. It's twice the size of the 2003-2004 edition, and it's put out by the first edition is put out by iUniverse, but the second edition was put out, yes, by BookSurge, and you can find that at Amazon.com. Thank you all for tuning in, and we hope to see you all on the other side. God bless.